You are listening to WLXU 93.9 LPFM Lexington. We are here today talking to Eddie Dean, award-winning music writer who's joining us from Washington, D.C. He is the author of Man of Constant Sorrow, My Life and Times with Dr. Ralph Stanley, and Kentucky Traveler, My Life in Music with Ricky Skaggs. Mr. Dean is currently an editor at Washingtonian Magazine. We are talking today about Jimmy Arnold, a native Virginian who was a titanic force in bluegrass music and who really deserved more recognition than he ever got in his life. Eddie wrote an article for the Washington City paper on Jimmy Arnold, and this was back in the 90s. Is that right, Eddie?
Yeah, it was like 1993, I think.
1993, and it's really an in-depth feature article on Jimmy Arnold, and hopefully at some point we can get it up online, but we thought it might be interesting to explore Jimmy's life in this episode and kind of go through the article because it's a magnificent in-depth feature on Jimmy and his ethos and his musicality. And I'm also here with Travis Kitchens, my co-host. So we are going to get started here. Jimmy Arnold had a very intense but brief life. He was born in Fries, Virginia. He died at the age of 40. And I wanted to get started in this conversation by just jumping around a bit. And I thought what we could do is first talk about what is considered to be his, magnum opus, the album Southern Soul, which was recorded in 1983. And then after we talk about that, maybe we can kind of backpedal to how he got his start. But I do want to say right up front, there is a Kentucky connection. Jimmy Arnold was bandmates briefly with both Keith Whitley and Ricky Skaggs, fellow Kentucky musicians that are very well known. So let's get started talking about Southern Soul. You write in your article, I really love how you put it. You said, when all is said and done, it is something akin to a 45-minute autobiography accompanied by strings. So can you tell us a little bit about what it was like doing the research for how Jimmy came up with the concepts for Southern Soul? Because from the article, it sounds like this is when he was in his 30s, he became more or less obsessed with the Lost Cause.
Yeah. Well, he had moved up to Fredericksburg from Fries and, hanging around the Washington, D.C. bluegrass scene, which was very progressive at the time. He played for a while with Cliff Waldron, New Shades of Grass, and they're like doing, covers of CCR, and that really wasn't his deal. And as he kind of faded away from that scene, he's in Fredericksburg, which has all these Civil War battlefields. He would, walk the battlefields, and he really just immersed himself in that history. So it really wasn't from his own background in the mountains. It was from this area he had relocated to. So that he really just became a sort of walking encyclopedia, not only of old Southern music styles, but of Civil War sort of lore. And what Southern Soul did was put it in the mind of one rebel soldier. And what Jimmy's song cycle does is sort of take you through the war and even after. And it's like he's singing in first person, but it's all these different images from the war as if he had fought in it. Some of the songs are original, and then he does the band, and he does Lorena, which was an old Civil War song that the soldiers sang, when they're homesick out on the battlefields. But it all comes through like it's as if he wrote the whole thing. So interesting sort of take on history.
And I should say the liner notes to this album were written by John Hartford. And in the liner notes, Hartford states how, I'm quoting him here, this almost psychic album comes clear more through research of the soul rather than research in the library, which is, I think, a testament to just like you were just saying, the soulfulness and the kind of almost mystically putting himself in the places of these long-gone Confederate soldiers. But you have a lot of interesting details in the article about just how obsessive he became. I mean, he started wearing a felt hat. He started hearing ghosts. And the album was recorded actually on the edge of Chancellorsville battlefield. So the whole, I really think in the album you can it does not come across as a mere reenactment or pretend.
It's not revival, and it's not retro or revival. It's more like a sort of personal testament with all these, spiritual and historical overtones. Like you said, he almost became like one of these soldiers. You can see this sort of physical transformation as he was reading about it. So he starts growing this pointed beard and long hair hanging down. He looks like A.P. Hill. He looks like one of the photos he had been studying from the war. There's one particular one that's in the back of Southern Soul where these rebel soldiers have been captured at Gettysburg, and they're along this snake rail fence, and they're just so proud even though they've been captured. So it's as if he's trying to look like one of those guys as well as be, in the character during the whole album. It's like method acting as, old-time music version, where you don't think it's Jimmy Arnold singing. As you're listening to the record, it sounds as if it's this old sort of audio oral history that somebody dug up and set to music.
And Eddie, whenever you started writing the article, was it easy to find people that? I think you told me one time you went down there and you were staying in your car. Did you hang out down there for a couple of weeks?
Yeah, I drove down to Freeze a few times, which is right near Galax. So he's in the hotbed of sort of southern mountain music. Galax has the big Fiddlers Convention. About an hour away is Bristol, where the Carter family is from, and the Stanley brothers are maybe 3 hours away. So you go down there weren't motels. At one point I did have to sleep in the car. But the town is completely, or at that time, was like a ghost town. It had been a mill town in the 40s and 50s and 60s when he was growing up, and then all the jobs left. So there weren't places to stay, really. And that's why he wanted to escape. There was nothing there. So he sort of took the music with him. And he ended up dying there after he had dried up and come home to live with his parents. Wow. But the place has all these guys who still were on the porch playing music. The old-timers hadn't left. So they would love to talk about Jimmy. He was like a sort of local hero to them.
Oh, wow.
So they remembered him winning contests when he was 10, 12 years old. Banjo, fiddle, he played guitar. So that's another thing. Everything he picked up, he could play. He even played Spanish dobro at one point.
Wow, and I remember you said his parents didn't play music, but they did. Yeah. He got a guitar, and then somehow he sold a cow or something and got a banjo. And I remember it said he was going to the festivals and winning, but the parents were even letting him drink at the festivals, so they seemed to support his
Yeah, they did. He was an only child. I think that was the thing. They saw his gift really early on, which sort of puts him in the same company as Keith Whitley and Ricky Skaggs and these guys who were child prodigies. So Jimmy was part of that. And when in the mountain culture, when that is seen at an early age, they honor it. They were probably naive about the drinking at these festivals at the time too. He probably didn't know what Jimmy was getting into. So there's one point when he goes with Charlie Monroe, who's sort of an obscure bluegrass singer at the time, and he wrote Legend of Rebel Soldier, which is on the Southern Soul. But that really got Jimmy drinking early and probably in a dangerous way.
Wow.
But Tommy Jarrell was another influence, the fiddler from North Carolina, not far away. He was an old-time fiddler. He became like a mentor to Jimmy. And if you listen to that one track on Southern Soul, it's called Sail Away Ladies. That's actually an old Civil War era song, and he introduces it, the song that Tommy had taught him, and then Tommy learned it from Confederate soldiers. So there's already a personal connection, as if, there's anointing through the song and learning it from Tommy Jarrell, who learned it from the rebel soldiers, that Jimmy's connecting personally, even on a song like that. Makes it really, like Hartford said, sort of a psychic connection.
Yeah.
It's also, I think, a fitting tribute, especially his arrangement of that banjo tune, a fitting tribute to Tommy Jarrell. And one thing I want to ask you about, you interviewed, I believe his name is Dick Freeland,
right,
who produced Jimmy's first album. And when you're talking about the same kind of nurturing musical background as Ricky Skaggs and Keith Whitley, both of whom are, recognized as being just virtuosic musicians, Dick Freeland is quoted in your article as saying, compared with Skaggs and Whitley at age 22, he was way ahead of them. So his natural genius from the time he was very small, it seems like the immediate bluegrass community was recognized unquestionably.
Yeah, I think compared to Skaggs and Whitley, he was more of an innovator. So even though he was carrying on a tradition of mountain music, even when he played something like Old Joe Clark or Shady Grove or a mountain tune, he would put this Jimmy Arnold inflection in it that really was just his own. And even Ricky doesn't have that. I mean, Ricky's great and a virtuoso, but not so much of a blues influence that he had. And Keith Whitley's probably a better singer than both of them, but I don't think Keith had the instrumental prowess that Jimmy had at such an early age. So everybody did recognize that.
So I just want to kind of shift here for a minute to give people a sense of what it might have been like to be in the presence of Jimmy Arnold. He wasn't alive for very long. Not very many people, relatively speaking, got to see him play live. And there's this one point you bring up in your article where it's a concert with Mary Chapin Carpenter, and he is sort of lumbering towards the stage, and he came to the concert to check out some fellow musician friends who were in her band. And you write, she saw a monster heading her way, 300 pounds, covered with tattoos, and topped with a death row buzz haircut, lumbering down the aisle. So, I know this was not his persona initially, but can you maybe talk about how he transformed himself from this sort of innocent, fresh-faced mountain boy into this just raw presence covered from head to toe in tattoos?
Well, like a lot of stuff with Jimmy, he just didn't do anything halfway. So once he got involved with the tattoos, it just went crazy. And then he got involved with like biker gangs. So a lot of it was trying to be tough. And you combine that with this kind of mountain guy trying to be like Celtic imagery. So he's getting it all over his body mixed up. Same way he did with Southern Soul, where he becomes this sort of protagonist who fought in all these battles with Jeb Stuart. He just became that. So by the time he's at that Mary Chapin Carpenter concert, I think it was High Point, North Carolina, it's 1990. He's really in recovery, sort of, but bouncing back and forth. So he's not been in the sort of festival circuit for a while, so they hadn't seen him for a while. And he just looked like something that one detective said, the detective that arrested him in Fredericksburg, Virginia, had said he looked like something that crawled out of the bowels of hell. Because at the time, he was so overweight, covered with tattoos, and a bib overall, and at the time, he wasn't really playing music. So, yeah, as a physical presence, it was kind of stunning. But as John Hartford said, it was like it was his shield, really, to be tough. All these tattoos and things like that was a way to, like, kind of fit in with the biker mentality. But really, he was just a mountain kid who would play a musical instrument like no one else, and the rest of his life is what he had problems with. On stage, he was great, even when he was messed up, apparently. So it scared the hell out of Mary Chapin Carpenter, because she's part of the kind of D.C. progressive folk bluegrass scene, and he's like from the real culture that she wasn't really part of. She's a suburban D.C. girl who I think liked him. They all loved him, but it was like she got frightened, seeing him come toward her.
Right. So he's a virtuoso musician, and he joins different bands. I know he goes to Nashville. I think very early on he goes to Nashville, and he's playing with somebody and getting drunk, and that sort of falls through. And then he goes to D.C. and plays with Keith Whitley, right? And doesn't he just play with these bands? And does he keep getting fired because of the drinking?
Yeah, I think at that point he had learned how to drink from Charlie Monroe and quit that band, and then Charlie Monroe's dead. And when he hooked up with his Cliff Waldron and the New Shades of Grass, that was when it really started to sabotage his career as far as getting fired. Because, the drinking just got in the way of his playing. I think he was in a band with Keith called New Traditions. Does that ring a bell? I'm not sure which band that was.
Yes, that's the band. Yep, New Traditions.
He was already self-destructing early on, but he could do it at a much more maintenance level than Jimmy. But they got along. I think they were very close for a while. And, it started to mess him up. But then he ends up in D.C. playing more stuff Tex Logan really adopted him really. Do you guys know? I mean, he was an old fiddler from the Lilly Brothers and
oh yeah,
the old days, and he was another mentor he found. And Tex Logan sort of sitting in with him with a band. They play Fredericksburg, D.C., and that was around the Southern Soul era stuff when he was probably at his creative peak would be early 80s. And that kind of led to Southern Soul. So he's able to get it together for those few years in the early 80s and do this masterpiece. But before and after was the problem. And the thing bombed commercially, so that's another disappointment. No one was ready for that type of album in 1983 because progressive bluegrass was sort of the king at the time, and his thing was how do you categorize that kind of work?
You're referring here to Southern Soul?
Yeah, musicians loved it, and it became like a cult classic early on, but it didn't sell. So he's like, I just did my life's masterpiece, and it doesn't sell, and it just sent him right back to the trouble.
And so, because Southern Soul, when it failed, is that when he got into selling the drugs?
Yeah, I think around that time he was in Fredericksburg and then hanging around with biker gangs, and there was some crystal meth, and he's selling that. So he ends up getting arrested and then turning over state's evidence, so he's hated by the bikers. He told on people. He did do a short amount of time. And then this starts the next period of his life is sort of bouncing around, playing solo. So he's kind of half into music and half in recovery in the late 80s. He'd go play Australia and do great, come back, and then go on a bender. And so it was never the same after the Southern Soul. A lot of unrealized projects.
Right.
It was going to be a blues album.
So when he got caught, he ratted on everybody, right? And they became angry.
Yeah.
I mean, people wanted to kill him, right?
That's another thing. Yeah, once he did that, he was a marked man, so he's in fear for his life. At some point, they put a tattoo on him, and then he was passed out, so they put a tattoo on his forehead or something.
Yeah, a lion.
Yeah, it was a lion tattoo on his forehead.
So it just got to. He was now halfway in the sort of criminal underground. His music is still good because when he played, they said he'd actually soaked up more influences. He was in Texas, somewhere near Waco for a while, and then he starts playing Western swing. So he's doing almost sort of this complete change in his musical style with Dixieland and even ragtime stuff. And so that's some projects he wanted to do later that he never did. So he was growing as a musician, even though his personal life was just going through hell.
Well, can we back up for a second and talk about the drug charges and the going to jail? Do you think that, he had this tendency to kind of take on personas, but it wasn't really, real in the fact that he would just get arrested and then immediately rat on everybody he'd ever, had drug dealings with? I mean, isn't that a sign that he wasn't that dedicated to becoming a drug dealer, and maybe it was just another thing to...
Yeah, I think it was peer pressure. I think it's one of these things where he wasn't even really a good drug dealer into drugs. As far as I know, he wasn't a user, so he just got into the biker culture, that drug culture around Fredericksburg, which is right on 95, so Interstate 95 goes right through it, so it was pretty much of a major sort of drug market for people going from New York to Florida. Just the wrong place at the wrong time, I think, more than anything. So even though it did cause a lot of trouble, it wasn't that wasn't his main problem, really. It was just self-destructive stuff.
And you have this, horrific guy. He's got a lion tattooed on his face. He's ratting people out. He went to prison. Bluegrass is so conservative, especially people like Ricky Skaggs, and the whole community seems to be very Southern, very conservative. Was he a total pariah? Did people just stop working with him, or how was he viewed within the bluegrass community at that time? Could he work, or?
At that point, I think he didn't pursue that. But yeah, he probably was an outcast at the type of festivals where Ralph Stanley was playing.
Right.
And then at the same time, he became sort of a folk hero on the folk festival because there was a parallel development where you didn't have to play the straight bluegrass places. There was some folky stuff, like in the north, let's say, and he'd go up there and do great because he'd sit down and he'd play like an old blues guy. So he's so big at that point, he's kind of in a chair like John Lee Hooker, but he's doing these old songs in a new way. So he could do it as a solo artist, but he just couldn't keep it together between those festivals. So in a way, he was breaking out of the bluegrass circuit. And yeah, he probably didn't have a lot of friends in that genre anymore, because he wasn't recording at Rebel Records at all after Southern Soul.
Right.
Which is still in print, incredibly. You know, it's neat that they have kept it in print.
Yeah.
I think his other stuff might be out of print.
So something that I think is maybe connected to the kind of accidentally falling into the drug-dealing biker gang world is his seeming inability just to kind of stick to the bluegrass country star persona and focus on a single identity. And this is something Travis and I were talking about, you know, and that I think that allowed him to just go to New Orleans and soak up different kinds of music there, and go to Texas and soak up Western swing and soak up the blues and start playing and get really, really immersed in all these different types of musics. And then I think, you know, you're going to, if you're trying to be a commercial recording artist, you know, people usually pay a price for not kind of sticking to one thing and having a, you know, single identity.
He kind of is like Ry Cooder in the sense you were just talking about, all those soaking up the influences, and then he made it all seem his own. He doesn't seem to ever be a derivative sort of thing, but see, he didn't have the stability of a Ry Cooder, and that was the problem. So he is going to these different places, but he isn't just... So if he goes to New Orleans, he's learning Dixieland and all these other styles, and then he's getting messed up on Bourbon Street. So the total immersion probably messed him up more than anything. He couldn't just get immersed in the music. At some point he's in, I think, Belize, like jamming with Mayan Indians in a cave or something. They had to pull him out of there and bring him back because he's supposed to be doing missionary work. So instead of Bible thumping and all this, he ends up playing guitar and like learning Indian folk songs with the Mayans. So stuff like that where he couldn't do it halfway. Right. His music, but it hurt his personal life.
And do you think that, I thought one of the most poignant things in here was, you said Southern Soul was a metaphor for his own sense of insecurity and alienation. After the harsh experience of his own life, the lost cause was the only ideal he could really relate to. Do you still think that after, I don't know, what, it's been out 15 years, that maybe that's what he saw in the Civil War and the lost cause of this fatalism that Southerners often have, in a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of we're not good enough and we're losers, and then set out to prove it?
I think so, yeah. He found like a philosophy behind what was messing him up and sort of adapted that in some way. Or he made it his own. Like, I think the lost cause meant something to him because as he learned about it, he's like, that reflects some of his own struggles. But then again, see, he didn't grow up in that culture. He got immersed in it in Fredericksburg. That's what's so interesting. He didn't come from a family of Civil War buffs.
Right. It was a wife, right? He's married 6 times, I think.
His 4th or 5th wife's dad was really a Civil War buff, and they'd go look for relics out on the battlefields, and he got Jimmy into it. And like always, he goes in full on all the way. But yeah, I think the thing, there's a credo on the back of the record where Jimmy talks about the lost cause, and it's not some kind of celebratory Charlie Daniels type of thing.
Yeah,
it's a quote.
I guess it's best to suffer some because vengeance doesn't pay. That's what he writes. It belongs to the Lord.
Yeah, exactly. So to him, it wasn't about the politics of the North versus South or any of it. It's sort of like his own way of finding some sort of larger conflict that reflected his own he could get into, and it gave him some kind of solace, probably.
Right. And
but the music is what, it doesn't sound like a modern album at all. I would actually say it sounds like a slick version of a Lomax field recording or something. It has this documentary feel to it. At the same time, it's very stylized and polished.
Right.
He knew what he was doing.
Right. And did you talk to the wives? I think you interviewed the wives. Do you remember meeting the wives?
Yeah, they still were. Well, 2 of them, I think, out of 6 I talked to, and they still were affectionate and stuff. Just they couldn't live with the guy. So, and he did have sons. At some point, there's a Grayson, named after a county in Southwest Virginia. I never did speak with them. I'm not sure how old they were at the time, but very rarely did anyone say he's awful or something like that. There's very fond memories of this guy when he was halfway not messed up. And all the musicians liked him. So it was a fun thing to report and research because you realize he was a good person underneath all the bluster. And he just, by the time he was 40, I think the body just gave out. It's almost like a John Belushi type of bluegrass death.
Right.
He's 40, I think. But yeah, by then, he didn't have anything else to put out there. I think he had fully dried out, but then the body just gave out.
Well, one thing I want to ask you about is you sort of pepper throughout the article about how throughout his short life, he traveled a ton. He went down to Mexico. He went all over, went to Australia. He went to all these places, and somehow, you write, he always managed to get hold of a guitar, borrowed or otherwise, to chronicle his wanderings. And you mention cassette tapes that he would record his songs on. And I'm wondering if, since you wrote the article, if any of these tapes have surfaced. I know there's been some recordings, video recordings put up on YouTube, private home recordings of him, but just a couple. There really isn't a lot of recorded live performances of him other than his albums.
Yeah, I don't think those have come out, and they'd be great to hear because they're very kind of bluesy and almost like Gordon Lightfoot, if that makes any sense, because they were storytelling, but he would just play guitar to his songs, and at that point it became like almost a folk singer-songwriter, Dylan troubadour type of thing. But yeah, I don't know who would have tapes of those. I know that Alligator Records, though, Flying Fish is what he wanted to do the blues album with, and those things just never got recorded. I'm not sure how much session stuff is in the can somewhere, and they haven't released it. I know for Southern Soul there were extra tracks, so maybe at some point they'll release like a 25th anniversary or whatever anniversary it would be, and then put extra stuff on there, because it would be great, because he was branching out. Yeah. And still writing. A lot of it was about his own mindset at the time, which is usually not going well, but he wrote about it in a really honest way, so it'd be like blues influence type of stuff.
Well, and I want to ask you about that too, the idea of branching out. There's a line in your article where you basically say he had done as much as he could do with the banjo after the Medusa track. And do you think that, to me, I think that's unusual, especially for a bluegrass musician, just to say, okay, I've pushed this as far as I can go. I'm done with it, and I'm gonna do something else. I think, again, that was really a testament to his just kind of chameleon-like ability to just slither into one thing and then keep going and keep going and keep going, without sticking necessarily to bluegrass.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the banjo, I think he would have done other stuff. You remember that one on Southern Soul? It's called Sail Away Ladies, and this is a Civil War type of song, but he learned it through Tommy Jarrell, and he almost introduces it like he's going to do it like that, but he definitely is not doing it in the old style. It's sort of Jimmy Arnold doing a Civil War song, so he might have gotten back into it if he got a hold of a good banjo again. I don't really think he left any instrument behind. I heard at the end that he liked fiddle the best. He went through a huge guitar stage where he liked guitar, but then they said fiddle was his favorite, or a bunch of musicians has said that, particularly like Western swing. I just think he got a kick out of it. I think he got a visceral sort of exhilaration that got him out of his depressed sort of state. Western swing's almost happy.
Yeah.
As compared to mountain music, it tends to be incredibly fatalistic. So that maybe gave him new horizons to think about and made him just happier to play it. So I could see him cutting a fiddle album, like a Bob Wills tribute like Merle Haggard did or something like that.
Right.
Well, I think maybe if you're willing to hang on the line, Eddie, we could just play a little bit of Sail Away Ladies from Jimmy Arnold's Southern Soul, just so people can hear it. So let's take it away.
I'm going to play you a song now that was shown to me by the best old-time fiddler in the business, and by far the most widely known, a guy by the name of Tommy Jarrell from Mount Airy, North Carolina. I first met Tommy when I was about 11 or 12, 13 years old when I first started playing music, and he used to take his fiddle and show me these old fiddle tunes, and I would learn how to play them on the banjo. And this particular song that I'm going to play for you is one that Tommy said that a Civil War soldier had shown him when he was a kid, called Sail Away Ladies.
You're listening to WLXU 93.9 LPFM Lexington. I'm Nadia, and I'm here with Travis, and this is Yesterday's Wine, and you are listening to Jimmy Arnold. That was Sail Away Ladies, and we are talking to acclaimed music writer Eddie Dean about the life and times of Jimmy Arnold. So that was Sail Away Ladies, and like you said, it's nothing like, the traditional tune as we know it, Sail Away Ladies. One of the things I also want to ask you about is how, did anyone talk about Jimmy's relationship with his parents throughout his life and what they thought of his music playing and his kind of the direction things were going?
I just know, he was the exalted only child, and they really loved him. And they took him back in near the end, so he died at his parents' house. So no matter what he did, they accepted him, and he would come back there and dry out and go into recovery. But like Travis had said earlier, they weren't musicians themselves, so that is sort of odd. I mean, maybe back in the family history there's fiddlers and whatever, but it was the town really that got him all those influences of the old-time music and freeze. So they were just very proud of Jimmy no matter what he did. They didn't like the title of the article, which was called Lost Soul, and that they took that to mean, in the Pentecostal terms, that's not what they thought. It just became, I think it was used because it was playing off of Southern Soul. Right. So it was called Lost Soul. But that isn't meant to be anything other than just a play off of Southern Soul, but they're quite religious, apparently.
So they did read the article?
Oh, yeah, I think they loved it.
Okay, cool. That's very cool.
So they, even in the town, he was still beloved and this and that, and he would come back home, and there weren't many local heroes like that at the time. It was a sort of ghost town. So he still, I don't know if he still remembered there today, but when I reported the article, it would be like you talking about Hank Williams or something coming back to Montgomery. That's how well known he was still, sort of held in the local imagination. I would find old-timers who still remembered the fiddle contest or banjo contest he won, and they remembered him really well, because he'd always come back and then talk to them. He always kept the connection, even late in his life.
Yeah, you mentioned in the article a show that he does when he comes back home to play, and it's been a while, and I think someone in the article says it was the the best show he had ever seen him play in his life, and he was thrilled and seems, very honored to be back home and playing in front of the folks that he grew up with, despite the fact
that... I think that meant a lot to Jimmy, and he had to sort of prove himself back to the locals. It's similar to what Ralph Stanley used to say, is like it's harder for him to sing in his local church than it is to play Carnegie Hall, because he feels like he's got the people right there that his neighbors and stuff there with him. So it's almost more pressure in that local setting than it is out in a professional setting. So that's probably what maybe made Jimmy play really hard that day.
And let's back up for a second and talk about, how at that point, how long had he been away from home? I mean, you talk about him going to Nashville, getting kind of invited to sit in and be a session musician in Nashville. I think I want to say Joe Green, if that is correct. The fiddler. And you talk about how he's, real fresh out of high school, goes to Nashville, thinks he's going to be living in some kind of mansion, and then it turns out that Joe's living in a trailer and is barely kind of getting by, and how that was a crash course, not just in the music industry, but really wasn't really a good environment for someone so young and so green.
Yeah, someone like me and Joe Green's another mentor where he picked up incredible musical tips, but then all the bad habits that went along with it, the self-destructive stuff and the drinking. So at that time, instead of like just trying to sort of change his ways and be just a student of the music, he goes straight into the nightlife and stuff like that. And I think he was disappointed when he goes out there and thinks the big time's going to be awesome, and it's just another trailer park like from back in Southwest Virginia, and that wasn't what he thought. So in some ways, he never thought of himself as a side man, like, one of these guys who's going to play sessions. I don't think he did play many throughout his career. Whatever albums like that he's on, it's whatever band he was with at the time.
I was just going to ask you, I was just going to ask you what his intentions were when he went out to Nashville, or what you think they were, if he thought he was going to be his own star, or if he did think he would make money playing music for whoever, or kind of what he saw for himself.
Right, because it was the thing to do. Someone like Keith Whitley from his same background was going to do that, or doing that. And it was just the natural thing to do, is go to Nashville. The interesting thing is, at the time, he's not a singer like Ricky or Keith Whitley at all. He's an instrumentalist, and so he doesn't sing hardly at all in any of those early bands. He might sing backup. And by the time, say, 1983 is Southern Soul, that's his first sort of vocals on record. And you wouldn't think so, because it's so understated and accomplished. And that's where he was going in the last part of his career, was just more of a singer-songwriter than a bluegrasser.
Yeah, and you talk about how he doesn't really start singing until pretty late in life. And, I know he could play every single instrument, but it seems like he didn't start singing until almost towards the end of his life.
And he adapted. His style was much more like a Bob Dylan, Gordon Lightfoot, who he played a lot of Gordon Lightfoot. He used to do a song called Early Morning Rain, and he did a great version of that. He would do it live, and that was the way he sang. It wasn't really mountain-style singing. If you think about how Ralph or Ricky sing, his voice is more introspective, very understated. It's not mountain shouting style. Particularly on Southern Soul, you can hear it's almost like he's under-singing on purpose.
Right.
Eddie, you compared Southern Soul to Pet Sounds.
Yeah.
Because
he was overdubbing a lot of the instruments. By then he was, he could play 6, 7 instruments. So he hasn't had any money to hire session guys. So he was at the studio in Fredericksburg, kind of overdubbing tapes with this guy, Peter Bontu, who's a very sympathetic producer, who's just a fan of Jimmy. So he's like, let Jimmy use the studio and we'll figure this out. And he did have some people stop by, like Mike Aldridge overdubbed the dobro, which is great on Southern Soul. It gives it a wonderful sort of archaic type of feel to it.
Yeah.
Aldridge's great uncle played with Jimmy Rogers on dobro. on some of those Victor sides. But at the Brian Wilson thing, I think is apt as well, because they're both like breaking down as they record their masterpiece, because Jimmy's life was falling apart when he recorded that. And but so he threw it all into the album. And at the time he was involved with biker gangs and tattoo parlor in Fredericksburg while he was recording this album. It's almost like two separate lives were going along.
Well, and you write that it sold about 10,000 copies, and I'm wondering, there's a quote in there from his wife at the time who said after the album he completely sort of lost motivation to tour or promote it. And I think, do you think it would have probably done better if he had still had the mindset of, getting it out there and touring?
Yeah, I think that's when the self-destruct button probably hit, where he wouldn't go out and promote it and stuff. Nowadays, he'd have a great band behind him. They'd just try to keep him straight, and he'd go on a tour, and he'd be great, because in a way, he was a very good between-song banter type of thing. If you listen to some of his stage stuff, he's really comfortable once he's on stage, and he's funny, and he's engaging, and he could present the songs. But way more than the Brian Wilson in that aspect, where he could go on stage and do it. And so I think it is a shame that the masterpiece didn't get the promotion, mainly because of his own fault. And at the time, it really wasn't exalted. I mean, musicians did like it, and it got critical response, but it wasn't something that a regular bluegrass fan would have wanted to hear.
Right.
Seemed like a throwback, maybe. And it's bad timing in that sense.
Well, to me, even after, decades, you still can't quite categorize the album Southern Soul. I mean, it's not bluegrass, not quite old time, not country. It's just, it really is being transplanted into the stories of these long-lost Confederate soldiers. And it's more storytelling to me, I think, than anything.
It is. Like, he just took all these musical elements that he had in his talent and skill set to create something that got the stories across. But what's neat, I was thinking, he benefited from the sort of progressive bluegrass at the time with the way the album sounds, because they learned how to record the music a lot better in the 70s and 80s. So ironically, the musicians weren't as good as the Flatt and Scruggs era, but the recording techniques had just caught up with that. And that's why the album sounds so intimate and almost symphonic in some ways. Well, like chamber music almost.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And you also mentioned some of the tracks weren't originally going to be on the album, like Lorena, and there are some other tracks that it was decided that they would fit into the Confederate theme, but he didn't necessarily originally have a plan for them to be included.
I don't even think he had heard the band's version of The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. He might have known Joan Baez's version, so he wouldn't have even put that on there, but it actually worked so well with the rest of the material, because from the point of view of a Confederate soldier that Robbie Robertson wrote. But then when Jimmy sings it, instead of sort of doing the kind of maudlin version that Joan Baez does, he totally undersings it, like the way the soldier would be tired or something, defeated. So it's absolute defeat is the way he sings it, not some kind of flag waving. And the other one was Lorena, which I think is an old song that soldiers sang while they were in battle or around campfires. I don't think he knew that one. So those were two good additions that really were of a piece with the rest of the record.
Right.
I love Lorena, the way he does that one. Alex Chilton does Lorena, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I never had thought about it before, but I guess it's fitting that Hartford wrote the liner notes because they both took that old-time style and that vast knowledge and studying with Tommy Jarrell, and Hartford was, learning from the people who knew Uncle Dave Macon, and then mixed it with that 60s singer-songwriter thing. So even though their style doesn't sound the same, it's sort of the same method, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think they're both working in Southern mythic stuff,
right,
but then mixing it up in a really interesting way. Like you said, coming from almost a hippie mentality.
Right.
With John Hartford, and with Jimmy, it's more of a biker outlaw mentality. If you think about people like David Allan Coe, they would love to be Jimmy Arnold. You know, Coe makes up most of the stories about his sort of criminal past. Jimmy lived that.
Right.
So it would have been incredible to do a prison album with this guy, because apparently, like, he would befriend the sheriffs. And one thing I just want to bring across, it's hard to without trivializing stuff, is the guy was a very happy person a lot of the times, and fun-loving and all this stuff you hear in the stories.
Yeah.
It's just music had dark overtones, and that probably obscures the fact that he was great fun to be around when he wasn't just on the floor with a bottle of, like, Crown Royal and stuff.
Right.
But yeah, his the bootleg tapes I had heard, is a hippie talking on stage as if he was like Milton Berle or something. I mean, he could handle the crowd.
Wow.
So he's not some shy guy staring at his feet, you know, like some of these virtuosos. He really could work the crowd, and that's what doesn't make sense as to why he didn't get bigger and get a bigger audience. Goes back to probably the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
You talk about with the lost cause and stuff. He just figured out that he wasn't going to make it.
Right. Yeah, it gives you some kind of story to...
Yeah. I mean, someone like Keith Whitley got right up to Nashville, hit the big time, and then self-destructed. You know, in a way, it's a Jimmy Arnold after you reach success in Nashville, then you do the mountain self-destruction that Jimmy did on the periphery.
Right.
And out of the three, Ricky Skaggs is the only one that survived all that kind of stuff.
Right.
It's really interesting as the three went different ways from those sort of mountain upbringings, the child prodigy and all that, and then Ricky's the only one still out there.
Right.
He loved Jimmy. He told me stories. He thought Jimmy was great. Same way he liked Keith Whitley.
Right.
But these guys were very, almost fun-loving people who just had a side of them they couldn't handle.
Well, I wonder if you're, you know, if that side of Jimmy is something that might have contributed to his musical genius, because it's sort of an all-consuming thing. Like you have said repeatedly, he couldn't half do anything. He had to go all the way all the time. And also, you know, he was not alive for very long. He was 40 years old when he died of heart failure. It's interesting to think about what would have become of Jimmy Arnold had he had a second or third chance. And I think you're right. You right at the time of his death, he was actually just getting back into music again, and had booked a tour in Eastern Europe, and was sober and church going. So we'll never know. But Eddie, it's been a pleasure to talk with you about Jimmy Arnold. One day we will have this article up so that other folks can read it, because for fans of Jimmy Arnold, and I know there are still a lot in Japan, because I was just looking at this.
Yeah, he was great. Yeah, in Japan he's big, in Australia people remember him. And it's a shame that there's not more of the music that they've released, and that's something that I'll look into. Is maybe there's stuff in the can that they haven't released. I think people would love to hear his guitar records and things like that.
Well, hopefully that will surface. But we want to thank you again, Eddie, for taking the time to talk with us, and we hope that you have a good day.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Eddie. We're going to go out with Jimmy Arnold's Sally Ann.
Ever stop me, Sally Ann. There ain't nobody gonna ever change the doggone way I am. I'm gonna rob and steal and run and hide, Sally Ann. Strap my pistols to my side, Sally Ann. Born way down in Grayson County, Sally Ann. Born of a Pentecostal cotton mill hand. Raised up rough and rowdy, Sally Ann. And there ain't nobody gonna ever change the doggone way I am. Whoa, whoa, Sally Ann. Whoa, whoa, the doggone way I am. Whoa, whoa, Gonna saddle my horse, try to save old Dixieland. Some folks say that we're gonna lose her, Sally Ann, but there ain't nobody gonna ever change the doggone way I am. Fredericksburg on the Chancellor, Sally Ann, there ain't no Yankee gonna ever stop us, Sally Ann. Stonewall's down, Ole's worried, Sally Ann. Stonewall's down, gonna be buried, Sally Ann. Whoa, ho, Sally Ann. Whoa, ho, the doggone way I am. Whoa, ho, Sally Ann. Whoa, ho, the doggone way I am.
This is WLXU 93.9 LPFM Lexington. You are listening to Yesterday's Wine. Until next time.